It's amazing to see all of you here tonight. We have over 100 students in attendance from Massachusetts, Connecticut, all over. Pretty exciting to see the student movement for liberty kind of get together here at Harvard and hopefully take off even more from here.
We had 30 people last year. 30.
We had 30 people last year. It's amazing. So let's get to the main reason we're all here. Mr. Schiff, Peter Schiff, is President and Chief Global Strategist for Euro-Pacific Capital. He's one of the few investment advisors to have correctly called the recession before it began. His accurate forecasts on the U.S. stock market, economy, real estate, the mortgage meltdown, the credit crunch, the subprime debacle, the whole thing, they brought him great renown. His first book, Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, was published by Wiley in early 2007, and it predicted the 2008 economic crash, while pretty much everyone in the mainstream was saying that it was impossible. Last year, Wiley released his follow-up bestseller, The Little Book of Bull Moves in Bear Markets, which kind of teaches readers how they can protect their finances from the ongoing crisis. And now his latest book is Crash Proof 2.0, and it advises readers how one can still make a profit now that the crash is actually here. So Mr. Schiff delivers lectures at major economic and investment conferences around the country and the world. He's been quoted often in the print media, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the LA Times, Time, Fortune. His broadcast credits include guest appearances on CNBC, Fox Business, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News Channel. He also has his video blog, which many of us here follow. And I'm sure many of you have seen his famous YouTube video, Peter Schiff Was Right, with millions of views on YouTube. He was also an economic advisor for Ron Paul's campaign in 2008, and he's running for the Republican nomination in his home state of Connecticut for the 2010 U.S. Senate. Mr. Peter Schiff.
First of all, let me just, in case anybody's wondering, I'm not fashion challenged. I'm not trying to set a new trend here. I simply forgot to pack my shoes. But anyway, I'm glad a lot of applause for my Senate campaign. How many people here have actually gone to my website and signed up to volunteer? All right, so for the rest of you, if you go, my website is schiffforsenate.com. And if you go there, there's a place to sign up to be a volunteer. And it's really important that you do that if you really want to see me get into the Senate. I think one of the ways that I'm going to try to overcome the mainstream Republican establishment that's backing another candidate and some other people who have access maybe to more funds than I do. One way to compensate for that, or to overcome that, is going to be with my volunteers. Most of the other candidates really don't stand for anything, so nobody's going to volunteer. They're just going to have to be paid. And so I think I can get a lot of people who believe in what I'm saying and what I'm trying to do, and if you can translate that into effort. One of the things that we're working on right now, and it'll be up on the website hopefully in a week or two, but it's going to be a way for people to volunteer even without coming to Connecticut. I mean, it'd be great to get some people to come down to Connecticut and actually, meet and talk to voters and, knock on doors and put signs out and man, card tables. But even from your telephone, we're working on a database where you can, log on to the computer or just go on the website and say that you want to volunteer to make phone calls. And I purchased the voter database for Connecticut. And so what you'll be able to do, if you want to call, it'll give you names and phone numbers. It'll just show up voters, Republican voters, or independent voters who will decide what we're trying to do. And you'll be able to make the phone calls, read a little bit of a short speech, ask a few questions, just input some of the answers, and then go on to the next guy. but the computer system will be keeping track of all the calls and making sure that we're not calling the same people twice, at least initially, and grabbing all the information that you've, all the feedback that you get and compiling it so that we have a snapshot every day about how the race is going. You know, is my support rising? Where is it effective? You know, where, you know, and then if the computer can see, okay, this is where we're making a difference, let's channel our phone calls there. So it'll be something that I don't think anybody's ever tried in modern politics, because they probably didn't have the manpower to make the phone calls. I want to have 10,000 people making phone calls for an hour a day into the state of Connecticut, which would be, if people can make even 10 calls an hour, that's you know, 100,000 calls a day. I mean, the whole race is going to be decided. The primary in Connecticut, it might be about 150,000 people who are going to vote. But all the voters, I think the entire election is going to be maybe 1.5 million people. So if we contact all these people in advance and let them know who I am and what I stand for, I think a lot of them might vote for me. And also, you'll be able to help fundraise in the same way. I have a list of donors that people will be able to call to actually hit them up for monetary contributions. So between getting out the vote and helping me get donations, people, you know, who believe in this cause can do a lot of work just with their laptop computer and a telephone. So again, just go to schiffforsenate.com and sign up. But anyway, what I want to talk about, I guess, today is the economy and where we are and where we're going. And I know, you know, a lot of people in this room. How many of you? Most of you are still in school, right? So I mean, at some point you're gonna be graduating and looking to get a job. And don't all call Euro Pacific Capital. But unfortunately, those jobs are going to be scarce for some time because the government is interfering in the market in such a way that the jobs of the future are not really being created. You know, they're being destroyed. And until the government understands and appreciates the nature of this economic crisis, it's not going away. It's just going to get worse. You know, we made these mistakes once before during what became known as the Great Depression. You know, something bad happens, and the government feels compelled to do something about it. Nobody can do nothing. Nobody wants to appear to not care. All the politicians don't want to be accused of not doing anything. What are you doing to help the unemployed? What are you doing to help the economy? And they can't, you know, resist that, so they have to do something. And of course, what they do makes the situation worse. But nobody usually can figure out. They don't see the connection between what the government is doing and the problem's getting worse. The government simply responds to the bigger problem with even, you know, more solutions. I've compared it to throwing gasoline on a fire. But you don't make the connection between the gasoline and the fire, so the fire keeps getting bigger and you keep throwing more on it. And eventually, you know, you have a raging inferno, and that's what happened during the 1930s, and they ended up with the Great Depression. The bigger problem for us is that during the 1930s, the economy was actually in better shape than it is now. And the government didn't have the power that the government has today. They were still constrained by a constitution. Now the constitution means nothing. The government does whatever they want. There isn't even a consideration that something might be unconstitutional. I can't even think of anything that the government would do that anybody would think was unconstitutional. So back then, when Roosevelt was around, I mean, he had to pack the court in order to get some stuff through. And even after he packed it, there was still a limit to what the New Deal could do. And even though Roosevelt was greatly expanding government, it came at a time when government was very small. I mean, government taxes were very low. You know, going into the 1930s, most people didn't pay taxes. I mean, there was an income tax that was just enacted in 1913, but only the very, very rich paid it. I mean, 1% maybe of the population paid the income tax. No one else even cared. It just didn't apply. Their incomes weren't high enough. There was no Social Security tax. So people really had no federal taxes. None of the states had income taxes. So, you know, all people paid were sales taxes. That was it, duties, you know. So the government was small. They didn't have, you know, no one really got checks from the government. I mean, the government paid for the army, which was a lot smaller, but that was really all it did. So when Roosevelt came in and decided to expand government, the country was relatively prosperous. We were rich. We had so many years without government. We had grown a very prosperous economy. We were an industrial society. We had a high savings rate. The economy got screwed up during the 1920s by the newly created Federal Reserve and the monetary policy that they pursued. But beneath the surface, beneath that bubble, was a sound economy, so we could afford all the mistakes that Roosevelt made. We would have been better off without them. And Hoover too, it's not just Roosevelt. Hoover actually set the precedent for what Roosevelt did. You know, in a way, George Bush is our Hoover. And he's laid the foundation for Barack Obama, who is the new Roosevelt. But, you know, even though we can afford all those gigantic mistakes, it would have been much better off had we not made them. You know, a lot of people think that the reason we got out of the Great Depression was because Roosevelt saved us. Right? They don't realize that the Great Depression lasted for over a decade. It actually went all the way through the Second World War. But Roosevelt didn't get us out of the Depression. He helped create the Depression. Had Roosevelt never done all the things that he did, we would have been out of it sooner. We got out of it despite what Roosevelt did. But a lot of historians who are very revisionist in the way they see things, and they also have an agenda. They want to believe that the government did this. They want to believe that there's something inherently wrong with capitalism, that it can't work unless government is there to right the wrongs of capitalism. But, you know, they make this faulty logic where they just simply assume we had a depression, we had the New Deal, we got out of the depression, therefore it was the New Deal that got us out. They don't know what would have happened had that New Deal never been dealt. So, but from everybody's perspective today, that's what we need to do. You know, we need more government. We're now in the greatest recession since the Great Depression, and since it was Roosevelt's New Deal that got us out, we need our own version of the New Deal to get out of this downturn. And that's a very dangerous way of thinking, especially now, as I said, given the fact that the fundamentals of the economy today are worse than they were back then. We're no longer, you know, the self-reliant, industrious economy that we were. We are, you know, in debt. We are the world's biggest debtor. We have huge trade deficits. We have no domestic savings. We have an enormous government. We have this huge service sector, a government economy. We're not producing enough. And the economy is all screwed up. Meanwhile, the government is already huge, and we're already paying high taxes. I mean, everybody in this country is paying Social Security taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, state taxes. You know, taxes are already high. And government is even bigger. I mean, even with all the taxes we're paying, government is even bigger than that. They're running deficits. So the government is absolutely enormous compared to where it was. In, I think Roosevelt's last budget was like $8 billion. That was double Hoover's budget of about $4 billion. Our budget now is over $3 trillion. Even if you adjusted for inflation, the dollar's lost about 95% of its value. So if you multiply 8 by 20, if the government had just kind of grown with inflation, the budget would be $160 billion. You know, from where it was at the end of Roosevelt's New Deal. So the government is huge. How can we possibly expand it? How can we afford it? How could our economy sustain more government? I mean, the only reason we're sustaining the government we have now is because the Chinese are lending us the money, or the Japanese are lending us the money. But how is anybody going to lend us money to afford, you know, Obama's socialized health care or whatever other gimmicks or, you know, that the government is going to try to finance because they think there's a problem that the government can solve? So we're now in a situation that has the potential of being worse than the Depression. And given our approach to solving the problem, that's more likely than not. And probably, you know, one of the most disturbing aspects of it is the people who are in charge of solving this problem in government are the people who caused it. And they're the people who didn't even realize that they were causing it. There are people, you know, as late I was going on these television shows or talking to other economists or market strategists. You know, this even in early 2008, they couldn't see this coming. They were saying there was no recession coming. We were already in one, and they couldn't figure it out. So if they don't understand how the economy got so screwed up in the first place, how do we expect them to solve the problems? And the major problem is they don't understand what went wrong. Most people look at the circumstances and they see that, oh, the problem is Americans aren't spending money anymore. See, during the good times, we were spending a lot of money and everything was great. And they think it's simply a function of getting us to spend money again, and all of a sudden, the economy is going to be, roaring. Well, they don't understand that the reason we're in trouble is because of all that spending. The economy wasn't strong because we were spending. We were spending because the economy was strong, but not our economy. It was China's economy that was strong. That's why we were spending, because they were making all the stuff for us to buy. And they were lending us all the money to do it. The fact that we were spending all this money didn't mean that we had a strong economy. Meanwhile, while we were spending all this money, nobody looked at all the liabilities that we were running up. I mean, sure, anybody can go out and buy stuff if you don't care what it costs. You don't look at your credit card bills. But to say that you're prosperous because you're spending money and not look at all the liabilities that you're accumulating in the process. Even right now, we've got this last quarter, GDP grew by an annualized rate of 3.5%, and everybody's all excited. But how much debt did we accumulate during that quarter to buy that little bit increase in GDP? Do we really think we're better off because we accumulated trillions of dollars of debt to get this little bounce in GDP? The corporation could say, look, I had a good quarter. I earned this profit growth. And so, but wait a minute, but what about all that money that you borrowed during the quarter? If you look at the whole balance sheet, the company could be worse off. Maybe they got an extra 10 million in profits, but they borrowed 100 million to do it. They didn't really make any money. The same thing is going on with our economy. So people think that all we've got to do is get the spending going. And they don't realize that in order to solve the problems, we have to stop spending. We have to actually do the opposite of spending. We have to save. We have to not buy stuff. But when I say that, well, people stop spending, well then people might lose jobs in retail. Well, you know what? That's got to happen, because that means there's too many people working in retail. That's the problem. We can't sustain spending when we're broke, right? And we need to rebuild our savings. You can't do that unless you stop spending. You can't spend and save the same money. It's either or. And we need to rebuild our savings so the economy can actually grow. Because economies don't grow because you spend. You spend because the economy grows. But what makes the economy grow is underconsumption. It's savings. Because savings is what makes it possible for capital to be formed, for businesses to start, for products to be produced, for jobs to be created. It all depends on capital, which all depends on savings. But the government wants to kind of maintain this spending because they don't want the economy to contract in a way that would be productive. What a lot of people don't understand, and it's very difficult, certainly now that I'm in the world of politics, because I talk a lot about the fact that the recession is necessary, and it is. But people try to spin that as if that means I like the recession. I want people to be out of work. I want people to lose their money. I don't want that to happen. I just recognize that that's what has to happen. I didn't want the bubble to be inflated. That's what I didn't want. See, the people who are upset about the bust, they're the very people that were championing and cheerleading the boom. But it was the boom that was the problem. It was when we were spending all this borrowed money. It's when the Federal Reserve, under George Bush, when Greenspan lowered interest rates down to 1% and everybody went out and bought houses, that was the problem. When the car companies took all that cheap money and gave 0% financing so people could buy cars, that was the problem, right? When we were all refinancing our homes and remodeling our kitchens and importing all these gadgets from all around the world, running $60 billion a month trade deficits, that was the problem. But everybody loved that. The politicians loved it. Wall Street loved it. They were cheering that economy. I don't know, these shows, they were calling it Goldilocks economy. They thought it was perfect. That was the problem. If we didn't, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. The crime was that reckless consumption. The time is going to be the recession that's necessary to fix the problem. So it's the boom is the problem. The bust is the solution. The bust is the cure. The mistakes are made during the boom. And I often talk about President Bush's quote before he left office when he talked about the fact that Wall Street got drunk. And that's a very good way to describe it. They were stinking drunk on Wall Street. But they were drunk on Main Street, right? The whole country was drunk. But with George Bush, what he didn't look at is where did they all get the alcohol? That's what I'm concerned about. Why was Wall Street drunk? Was it just spontaneous? No. Somebody had to give the alcohol, and they got the alcohol from the government, right? Alan Greenspan was the bartender. He liquored everybody up. And the government made sure that the bar never closed. And so everybody got drunk. And when you're drunk, you do things that you wouldn't do when you're sober. And when you wake up, when the alcohol starts to wear off, and you realize, oh my God, we were loaning people money to buy houses with no down payments? We were qualifying them based on the teaser rates? I mean, there's a lot of things, right? You go to these college parties, and you wake up the next day. I can't believe I did that, right? But, the free market eventually came to its senses. And, we better tighten up on these lending standards. We can't make these kind of loans anymore. But the minute that starts to happen, and people start to act responsibly, the government's like, oh my God, we can't have this. We need to liquor everybody back up again. We can't go through this hangover period because that's what the voters don't want. So in the boom-bust cycle, the bust, that is the hangover. That's the part where, it's not pleasant. But you can fix the mistakes that you made when you were drunk. And so that's what the economy started to do. Right? When Americans are not spending anymore, the government is trying to figure out how can we get Americans to spend more money. But why would we want them to do that? They're broke. They have no savings. Right? For the last decade, they were spending because they thought they were rich. They were wrong because they were drunk. They thought their 3-bedroom, 2-bath condo was worth twice what they paid, even though they had lived in it for 5 years and it was wearing out. Why should it be worth more? Well, they were drunk. They didn't know. And so they spent money, and they figured it would keep going up. So they have to make up for that. People have to save now because they spend too much. And that is the process. Now, a lot of people, obviously, during the boom, we built too many houses. Okay, there are too many people working in construction. There are too many people working in stores where, we were selling appliances and furnishings and while people thought they were rich because they had all this home equity, maybe they went to the theater more than they should, or maybe they ate more restaurants than they should, or maybe they bought fancier clothes or took more vacations. There's a lot of things people did because they were drunk and they thought they had more money. So all this has to stop. And sure, maybe we have people that are employed in areas where they shouldn't be. Our service sector economy got too big as we were spending this money. Meanwhile, the manufacturing sector got too small. We need to produce more stuff. We need to make more things. And so we have to have a transition because people have to leave the service sector to get into the goods production sector. There's only a finite amount of labor, and if somebody's doing one thing, they can't do something else. So they have to be able to reallocate labor as well as capital. We have capital that is in areas where it shouldn't be. I mean, a perfect example of the government trying to interfere with the market. We're still building homes. We're still, as part of last quarter's GDP, one of the big factors in the increase was residential construction. Now, why are we constructing homes? We got a glut of homes. Fannie Mae is sitting on 65,000 homes that they've foreclosed on that they're keeping off the market because they can't find buyers. Why are we building new ones? It's because the government is funneling more money to the home building industry. We're giving tax credits to people to buy homes. And in fact, Congress, the Senate, 98-0, just passed an extension of the home buyer's tax credit and expanded it. Not just to people who are renting and want to buy, but to people who already own homes and want to buy a bigger home. We're going to give them a tax credit to do that. Why is the government trying to steer resources into home building? We don't need any more homes. There's a lot of other things we do need. We're running huge trade deficits. We need to produce stuff. But the one thing I know we don't need to produce right now is new homes. But we're still doing it because of government subsidies. Same thing with automobiles. I mean, we got people buying new cars. We did cash for clunkers. Why do we want to encourage our citizens to spend money, to go deep into debt to buy cars? I mean, here people are already driving cars. Right? The cars had to be on the road. In order to qualify for cash for clunkers, you had to be driving a car that worked. and then the government gave you $4,500 to destroy it. And then after you destroyed it, they helped you get a loan to buy a more expensive car. And now you have car payments that you didn't have. And you bought a car that you never would have bought if it wasn't for the government. But why is the government taking resources and diverting them into more consumption when that's the opposite of what we need? So the government is trying to figure out how to reflate this bubble. How can we liquor everybody back up again so we can get the party going? But they don't realize that at this point it isn't going to work, because the bills for the party were going to China. They were going to Japan. And they're tired of paying them, because we took them for a pretty big ride in 2008. I mean, the whole world, went down, and it was, because we spread this, toxic debt all around the world. I mean, all these mortgage-backed securities. We bankrupted a town in Norway on mortgage-backed securities. So the world is really not interested in funding another one of these wild parties. So the only source left is Ben Bernanke. And to show how politicians never learn from their mistakes, even when they can see them, right? It's pretty clear now in hindsight to a lot of people that the cause of our problems was that interest rates were too low under Greenspan. After all, they were 1%. Well, now they're 0. Well, if 1% was too low, what's 0? That's where Bernanke's got them. And Bush was running deficits. Well, they were still big. They were $300-400 billion a year, 300, 200. Now they're $1.5 trillion or close to $2 trillion. Barack Obama, he campaigned on change. That was his whole idea, right? George Bush is doing it wrong, I'm going to do it different. Well, what's he done different? He's doing it the same way. The only thing he's changed is the size of the mistakes. Right? He makes them bigger. Because Bush came in similar circumstances to Obama, but it's just not as bad. He inherited a recession from Clinton. Why was there a recession? Because we had a boom in the 1990s. Why did we have a boom? Fed kept rates too low. Where was the bubble? Stocks, particularly internet stocks. What did that mean? That means capital was malinvested. That means money was funding companies that shouldn't have been funded. People were drunk during the 1990s. Greenspan liquored them up. But they sobered up in 2000 when rates went up on September 11th, and we had a bust. Should have had a pretty severe recession. We didn't. Why didn't we? Well, because of the stimulus. The stimulus interfered with the recession. Now, from a political perspective, that was great. And President Bush constantly bragged about the fact that the recession, on his watch, it was the shallowest recession ever. Because during that recession, we had record car sales and record home sales. Well, the price of those record car sales and record home sales was that GM and Chrysler went bankrupt because people bought cars that shouldn't have bought them, and we bankrupted our car companies. And the price for the record home sales was the collapse of the mortgage market and a housing bubble and the bankruptcy of pretty much our entire financial system. Was it really worth it? I mean, wouldn't it have been better if Bush just did nothing and let the recession run its course? Well, politically, maybe not, because maybe the voters would have been mad and he wouldn't have been reelected. That's all they cared about. Bush was like, how do I get reelected? And the way they got reelected was, let's stimulate the economy. Even though it's not really the economy they stimulate, but what's wrong with it? They're stimulating the problems. They're preventing the market from curing those problems and getting a real recovery. And so what does President Obama do? He does the exact same thing. He comes in and he inherits a recession from Bush. Right? We have a busted bubble. This time it's real estate, not stocks. Now we're in a recession. And what does he do? What's his solution? It's the same thing. Stimulate the economy. Low and cheap interest rates, low interest rates. Well, now 0%. Deficit spending. The exact same thing, only on a bigger scale. Now again, it would be better if we do nothing. The government does nothing and lets the recession happen. Now, of course, since the problems are bigger now, right? We had a bigger dose of stimulus. in 2001, 2002 than we had in the 90s. So the bigger the stimulus, the more the damage. Like the bigger the high, the bigger the come down, the worse the withdrawal, the worse the hangover. So now we really are in a situation where if we do nothing, it's really gonna hurt. Because we made a lot of mistakes. And that's why the politicians are so reluctant to take that approach. They say, well, we can't. We have to save. People say, well, imagine if the government didn't bail out all these banks. Yeah, it would have been horrible. Because you know what? A lot of them would have failed. Almost all the Wall Street investment banks, in fact, probably all the investment banks would have failed. And a good number of the commercial banks would have failed. The losses would have been horrific. Creditors would have lost money. Depositors, you know, the government actually had to bail out the money market funds. A lot of people would have actually lost money in money market funds had the government not stepped in. So it certainly would have been bad, and I knew it was going to be this bad. When I wrote in Crash Proof, I wrote about Fannie and Freddie were going to go bankrupt. I was talking for years that this is going to be a disaster, that it was going to be huge, that it was the price we were going to pay for the Bush stimulus. Now the question is, what's going to be the price of the Obama stimulus, of the Bernanke stimulus? Yes, what the government did temporarily eased the pain. Just like what Bush and Greenspan did, eased the pain in 2001 and 2002. There's no question that what the government has done thus far has cushioned the blow of this recession. But what we have to ask ourselves is, at what cost? What is the payback? And how long are we going to wait for the bill? I don't think we're going to get as many years as we did under the last one. So the last, we got about 5 years of phony growth. We had a 5-year party before it ended. This time, we'll be lucky, and not lucky, if it's half as long. But what is going to happen to this economy in the years ahead is going to be horrific in comparison. And we are going to, it's going to hurt much worse. As bad as it would have been to let Lehman, not just Lehman or Bear Stearns, but Morgan, Goldman, B of A, Wells Fargo, a lot of these banks, as bad as it would have been to let them fail, what's coming is going to be worse. That's the problem. It's always short-term gain for long-term pain. Only this time the pain is going to be excruciating. And what that pain is going to be a complete collapse of the value of our currency. Because what happened is, the government didn't make these losses go away. They only bailed out everybody by printing money and by guaranteeing debt. A lot of the debt now is simply guaranteed by the government. It's still going to go bad. The government is guaranteeing just about every mortgage in the country. The government has taken over General Motors and Chrysler. They didn't stop them from hemorrhaging money. They're still going to lose money, but now those are government losses. The entire subprime real estate market, which would have gone away, is now being run by the government. FHA is now guaranteeing, I think half of all the mortgages now, I think 25-30% of them are already FHA guaranteed, and those mortgages come with 3.5% down payments that people buy with tax credits. And I was like, one of the things that Fannie just said they're going to do, because so many people aren't paying their mortgages, they're just going to take the deeds from the homeowners and rent them back. Now, what a crazy thing for them to do, because here you have, these are people that can't even qualify for modifications. And they're living in houses now, they probably bought them a few years ago, with arms, they're underwater, their homes are worth a lot less than their mortgage. Chances are they haven't spent a nickel on maintenance over the last few years. So they probably got, problem. The roof could be leaky, the garbage disposal doesn't work, the toilet is, doesn't work right, the heater isn't working, all kinds of problems. Now the government is able to, or the homeowner is able to hand the deed to the government, get a low rent, because remember, he might have been paying, $2,000 a month in mortgage, and now he can pay $750 a month in rent. But not only does he take his payment down, he doesn't have to pay property taxes, but now the government has to fix all that stuff, because the government's a landlord. So now the government's got to fix his sink and fix his toilet or his appliances. And what's that going to cost the taxpayer? And remember, when a private landlord wants to, repair the sink, he goes and finds the cheapest plumber. The government's not going to do that. I mean, remember, the Pentagon and their $500 toilet seats? Well, imagine how many of those we're going to have when the government owns all these houses. And of course, why isn't Fannie just selling those houses? You would think that the government, if someone's can't pay their mortgage, sell the house, foreclose and sell it. They don't want to sell it because they don't want anyone to know what real estate is worth. They don't want people to realize that their houses are worth even less than they think because A, they don't want the banks to know it because they've abandoned mark-to-market accounting again, and they have mark-to-fantasy. And you have all these banks now that are pretending their real estate portfolios have value. Well, if Fannie and Freddie started foreclosing, everybody would know that they have no value. These banks are all insolvent, but now all the losses are on the government. So I think it's going to be horrific, and I think we're very close. You can hear all the rumblings. The Chinese, we need an alternative to the dollar. They don't want to buy our debt. They don't want our currency. They realize that it's not going to be worth anything. Now, we think that, the Chinese have no choice, right? That the Chinese, they have to buy our dollars because they own so many of them. They don't have to. And especially when, let's say they own $1 trillion, but we're asking them to buy another 5 or 10 trillion, they're going to worry more about what we want them to buy, not what they already own. And you can see, last week the Reserve Bank of India bought about $7 billion. They bought 100 metric tons of gold. Why do you think they did that? They paid over $1,000 an ounce. They realize that the dollar's days are numbered. You're having, people around, central banks around the world are going to be buying gold. So we're not going to be able to finance this the way we did in the 90s and in the early part of this decade by borrowing from the rest of the world. And, the idea, we keep thinking too that, the world needs to buy these dollars because they need our market. They need to be able to sell us products that without American consumers, all the people working around the world would be unemployed because, there'd be no one to buy their stuff. And this is probably the most, asinine concept that will one day, when the historians write about this period, this will be, when I read, you read some of these books. How many people read the Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds? It's a good book, and you read that, and you think back, and you think of, you're reading it, how can people have been so stupid? Well, now I know. Because they are stupid. This is how they act in crowds, But the idea to think that, that without us, the workers would be in so much trouble. I mean, anybody, people don't work because they enjoy working, at least most people. They work because they want the production associated with work. And just having a job is not all great, all the slaves had jobs, right? The problem was that they didn't get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. That was why slavery was bad. Well, so just because the Chinese get jobs out of this doesn't mean that they're better off. The key is to get the stuff, right? Not just to get the jobs. Right now, we're getting all the stuff. People think, well, the Chinese can't afford it. Well, sure they can. If they can produce it, they can afford it. Because that's what makes it affordable, the fact that they can make it. It's Americans who actually can't afford all the stuff, because we don't produce it. And more people think that it's somehow, that economic growth, it's all because of demand, that, we want things. That the Chinese want stuff too. They're no different than we are. The Chinese workers aren't, in these factories. Let's say you have someone's working in a factory and they're producing, dishwashers. And the workers aren't sitting there, working hard, working 12 hours a day in these factories, making these dishwashers. And they're not just thinking, gee, I'm glad I don't have one of these. Like, I want to wash my dishes by hand. They want them, they just can't afford them because the Chinese government is taking all their purchasing power and giving it to us. But if they stop doing that, if the Chinese stop buying our dollars, then we couldn't take those washing machines. It wouldn't mean that they'd stop making them. It just means that they would get to consume them too. Right? Then they'd get the jobs and the reward. It's not like everybody wants things. The government thinks that the key to economic growth is stimulating demand. We keep hearing that. Demand is down. Demand is never down. It's production that's down. It's supply that's down. That's what needs to be stimulated. I drove here in a car. I didn't fly here in my own helicopter. Well, I want one. I'd like to keep it parked on my yacht. The government doesn't have to stimulate all that desire in me. What limits it is production, how productive I am. That's what limits what I can buy. But I want all kinds of stuff. The same thing in China. They want everything we want. And so they don't have to worry about demand. It's there. Right? They don't need our demand. There's 1 billion people in China. We need their supply. We need our production. You see, if the Chinese stop sending us their goods, they get the goods. What happens in America without all the imports? What would be on the shelves at Walmart if we couldn't get stuff from paper? The shelves would be empty. All we have is paper. So, and that's what's coming. So we're going to get this big crash in the dollar because of all the money we printed. All the government has done, we haven't eliminated these losses. We've just changed their form. The government made it so that if you had money in the bank, you didn't lose your bank account. Your bank made a bunch of stupid loans, but your money's still there, right? Well, the government isn't magic. Right? They can't create wealth out of thin air, but they can transform through a monetary sleight of hand how those losses are going to hit you. So instead of losing your money is going to lose its value. And that's what's going to happen. But the problem with that is people that didn't do stupid things lose as much money as the people who did, maybe more. So we're going to have a crash in the dollar. And the dollar is going to collapse. And when that happens, prices are going to go through the roof for consumer goods, for most particularly for commodities like food and energy. Initially, the government will say it doesn't matter because it's not part of the core CPI. But eventually, the rest of the stuff will go up too. Eventually, interest rates are going to go up dramatically. They have to. And we're going to be deeper into debt. I mean, people think we solved our problems. We've got more debt now than we did when the problems first surfaced. So how can we have solved them? We found ourselves in a hole, and our solution was, let's dig in deeper. So imagine how much worse the crisis is going to be when we have higher interest rates on more debt. And the government doesn't learn anything, as I've said before. One of the big problems with the mortgage market was ARMs, teaser rates. Because of the 1% Fed funds rate, a lot of people were able to get mortgages that were, for the first few years, they had a very low payment. And that enabled people to buy houses they couldn't afford, because for a few years they could afford the payment. They couldn't afford the payments later on, but no one cared because by then they were all going to be rich. So it didn't matter if your mortgage payment doubled because you were going to be rich because you bought a house. Well, the government is making the same mistake. The huge deficits that we have right now, they're being financed with short-term bills. The national debt is like one big adjustable rate mortgage. The Chinese and the Japanese have given us a teaser rate. Well, what happens when it resets and interest rates double, triple, quadruple? We can't make the payments. It's just impossible. So the only way to finance it is by printing money. And then we're going to have this real crisis. Because then the government is going to be forced to do something very, very uncomfortable. See, the last time we had to make a choice like this was when Ronald Reagan came in 1980 and we had Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker was maybe the last central banker to actually do the right thing. And when he did the right thing, he was very unpopular. People wanted him to be impeached. Volcker is very popular now, but he was vilified in 1980. Everybody hated him because he was taking away the punch bowl. You think he was popular for having 20% interest rates? You think, he thought, what interest rate is going to make me popular? 20%. No. It was the tough medicine that the economy needed. Right? Now, we're going to be in that situation sometime, maybe in 2010, maybe 2011. The dollar is going to be in serious decline. We will breach through the 70 handle on the dollar index. We'll be going through 60. The dollar will be under serious pressure. Oil prices will be back well above 100, maybe headed towards 200. Food prices, everything's going to be going up. Long-term interest rates are going to start to move up. Unemployment, of course, is going to keep getting worse. It's not going to get better. So unemployment might be 13% or 14% officially. Unofficially, it'll be over 20%. And the government's going to be forced to raise interest rates. Raise interest rates into that worsening recession. Now, if they do it, then you're going to have all of the entities that they bailed out fail again. And they're going to have to let them fail. They're not going to be able to rescue them again. Because if they do, the dollar will fall even more. And so if they do the right thing, we're just going to have an even worse recession than we would have had if they had done the right thing sooner. But they're going to have to develop the political will to do what they haven't done yet. Right? And that's raise interest rates into a weakening economy and force the government to stop spending. Refuse to monetize government debt. Force the government to reduce its workforce and cut back on its expenditures. That's going to happen to save the dollar. That's what needs to happen. It'll be a very painful process. I wish we had done it sooner, but wishing isn't going to make it so. We'll have to do the right thing. The alternative is they refuse to do the right thing. The Fed tries to accommodate all of that by printing even more money, and then we're going to get the equivalent of a monetary overdose of stimulus. And the monetary overdose is hyperinflation. And in hyperinflation, you destroy the value of the currency completely. And that would be the absolute worst thing that can happen. Because that will bring on a period in this country that, it's even hard to imagine how bad things would get during that type of environment. I mean, that's what laid the foundation for the rise of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, in Germany, following their hyperinflation. I mean, they had that in Argentina 100 years ago, and the country never, look where they are today. They were one of the richest countries in the world 100 years ago. Now they're, hyperinflation destroyed. Look what's going on in Zimbabwe right now. And, none of these countries wanted hyperinflation. It wasn't their intention, but it was politicians trying to avoid telling the truth. Nobody wanted to, deliver the bad news, admit to the voters, that they had lied, that they had overpromised, and that there's nothing government can do. So this is what's going. This is a choice that we're going to have to make. I'm still hopeful that we'll make the right choice, and I'm trying to run for the Senate to try to be there to influence that choice, to hope that by then. Because I think that this crisis will certainly come if I win this Senate term, it will happen during my tenure of that 6 years. And somebody needs to be in the Senate that understands the problem and that understands that the solutions are not in the government. The solutions are in the market. The government created the problems. They're serious, but they're not insurmountable as long as the government gets out of the way. There are certainly things the government can do to make it a lot easier for the market, meaning, and when I say the market, I mean every individual American working hard, entrepreneurs, individuals, just working, trying to make as much money as they can in a market economy, will get out of this. But the things that the government needs to do, a real government stimulus, would be to, reduce regulation, reduce tax, reduce spending, and to let the market function. And of course, right now, and one of the real fallouts or the problems of this last episode is that the free market is once again getting the blame for a problem that was created by government. And all the time when I'm speaking now and I say we need deregulation, we need free markets, inevitably it's like, well, isn't that how we got into this mess? Didn't just Wall Street run amok? Isn't this all greed? Isn't this all capitalism? No. As I said, it's all government. Government set the stage. Government dealt the cards. Wall Street played it, but that's the hand that they got dealt. And if it wasn't for the cheap money from the Fed, the markets never would have set interest rates that low. If it wasn't for government guarantees through Freddie and Fannie, people never could have borrowed all that money without government guarantees. If it wasn't for legislation and government pressure to make certain types of loans, if it wasn't for a Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, who let Wall Street believe that he had their back, if anything went wrong, he was there with a green pen foot. Unfortunately, it was true. Look at all the bad. Goldman Sachs now just is passing out record bonuses this year. Goldman would have gone bankrupt if it wasn't for government bailout money. meant General Electric would have gone bankrupt if it wasn't for... There are a lot of huge companies, named companies, that would have gone bankrupt had the government not bailed them out. So unfortunately, they were all reckless. And they didn't have to suffer because the government bailed them out. And that's the moral hazard that we've set up. I mean, if you're going to take risk, you have to be punished if it doesn't work out. I mean, you had people that were putting money in treasuries because they didn't want to take risk. Meanwhile, the people who did all these, the people who were taking risk ended up with a much better return, and they didn't have to suffer any adverse consequence when their bad bets went south. But anyway, I don't want to take time for some questions. But so the problem is going to be that the free market had got such a bad reputation, especially with George Bush, trying to pretend. He said we have to abandon capitalism to save it. The problem, he abandoned it when he took the oath of office. So people associate capitalism with Bush, capitalism with the failures that are actually failures of government. So it's going to be hard. So somebody needs to be in the Senate to really remind everybody exactly why the nation was so prosperous. And when the problems first emerged, it was the first thing they could think of was, yes, we're all capitalists, but this is an emergency. They said, this is no time for principle. We need to take action. As if you abandon your principles the minute things get difficult. As if capitalism only works in good times, but in bad times you need socialism. The reality is, it's in good times where you can actually afford a little socialism. It's not a good thing, but at least if you're prosperous, you can afford the extra waste, the extra government. It's during tough times when capitalism is needed most. If we're going to turn this situation around, we have to fully embrace it. We can't pretend that things are so bad that we have to abandon capitalism and turn to socialism, because that is what is going to take a bad situation and make it horrific. But anyway, hopefully, if I could win this Senate seat, maybe you guys can help me do that. There'll be one voice of reason in the United States Senate, and maybe we won't take that final final fork on the road to serfdom. Anyway, thanks everybody.